There are places that exist more in our memory than they ever did in reality. They become legends. The Garden of Eden, Atlantis, and the greatest of them all, the Library of Alexandria. A place that held all the knowledge of the ancient world under one roof. It was more than just a building filled with scrolls. It was an idea, a promise that humanity could collect, understand, and preserve its own story. But if you ask how it ended, you'll get a dozen different answers. A great fire. A conqueror's rage. A slow, sad decay. The truth, as it often is more complex and far more tragic. Because the Great Library of Alexandria didn't have one final, heroic last stand. It suffered a death by 1,000 cuts, a slow unraveling over centuries. This is the real story of how the world lost its mind and the desperate, flickering light of knowledge in its final hours. To understand what was lost, we first have to understand what it was. Imagine a world without the internet, without public education, where books were incredibly rare and precious. Now, imagine a place that set out to own a copy of every single book in existence. Founded in Egypt in the 3rd century BCE by the Ptolemaic dynasty, the library, or Mouseion, was a marvel. It wasn't just a library as we think of it, but a research institution. Scholars from across the known world lived and worked there, their expenses paid, their only task, to think, to debate, and to write. The Ptolemies were obsessed. Their agents scoured the world for texts. Ships docking in Alexandria's harbor were forced to surrender any scrolls they had on board. Scribes would then copy them, keeping the original for the library and giving the copy back to the owner. They were building the world's first universal database of human thought. And the minds that gathered there, they truly changed the world. It was here that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with stunning accuracy, using just shadows and simple geometry. It was here that Euclid wrote the Elements, the foundation of mathematics for the next 2,000 years. It was here that the human body was first dissected and studied, revealing the secrets of our own anatomy. This was the library's golden age. A beacon of intellect, shining from the coast of Egypt. For a few brilliant centuries, it felt like there was nothing humanity couldn't discover. But empires crumble, and the flame of knowledge is fragile. The decline didn't start with a fire. It started with politics. Around 145 BCE, the ruler Ptolemy VIII, a cruel and paranoid man, expelled all foreign scholars from Alexandria. Imagine that. The brightest minds, the very heart of the institution, were forced out. The library's spirit began to wither. The flow of new ideas slowed to a trickle. Support from the rulers waned. Budgets were cut. The great project, once the pride of an empire, started to feel like a burden. The focus shifted from groundbreaking discovery to just preserving what was already there. Think of it like a magnificent old house. For generations, it was filled with life and vibrant conversation. But now, the children have moved out. The paint is starting to peel. Dust gathers in the quiet halls. It's still standing, still grand, but the soul is leaving. That was the Library of Alexandria for the next couple of centuries. And with neglect comes physical decay. The papyrus scrolls, the very vessels of knowledge, were fragile. They needed constant care, recopying, and protection from the damp Mediterranean air. As funding dried up, this vital work slowed. Scrolls that had survived for centuries began to crumble into dust, their secrets lost not to a blaze of glory, but to simple, silent neglect. The library was becoming a ghost of itself. It was still a revered name, a symbol of a bygone era, but the engine of progress had stalled. It was vulnerable, a shadow of its former self. And then came the first great blow. The year is 48 BCE. A new power is rising in the world, Rome. And its most famous general, Julius Caesar, is in Alexandria, embroiled in a civil war. He's cornered in the palace district, his back to the sea. To gain a strategic advantage, he sets fire to the enemy Egyptian fleet in the harbor. The fire spreads. It rages along the docks, consuming warehouses and buildings. And according to some accounts, this is it. This is the moment the Great Library burned. A tragic accident of war. It's a simple, dramatic story, but it's probably not the whole truth. Most modern historians believe that fire never reached the main library itself. What likely burned were warehouses near the port. Warehouses that stored scrolls, possibly tens of thousands of them, waiting to be processed into the library. A devastating loss, for sure. A wound, but not a fatal one. The library, the Mouseion, survived. Damaged, certainly, and with a huge part of its collection gone, but it was still standing. The idea endured. But the world around it was changing in ways that would prove far more dangerous than fire. The Roman Empire absorbed Egypt. The intellectual center of the world shifted from Alexandria to Rome itself. The library became a provincial institution, less important in the grand scheme of the new empire. It continued to fade. But its final chapter would be written not by conquerors or generals, but by a new, powerful force, religion. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire was becoming Christian. The old pagan gods and the philosophies of the Greeks were increasingly seen as dangerous, heretical, and the library, with its scrolls of Aristotle, Plato, and 1,000 other pagan thinkers, was the ultimate symbol of that old world. By this time, a significant part of what remained of the great collection was housed in a daughter library, a magnificent temple in another part of the city called the Serapeum. This is where the last stand would truly happen. In the year 391 AD, the Bishop of Alexandria, a man named Theophilus, received a decree from the emperor. All pagan temples were to be destroyed. Theophilus, a zealous and ambitious man, set his sights on the Serapeum. He led a mob, filled with religious fervor, through the streets of Alexandria. There was no single great fire here, either. It was a demolition, a systematic dismantling. They stormed the temple, tearing down the statues of pagan gods, defacing the walls. And the scrolls, the last great repository of ancient knowledge, were pulled from their shelves, scattered, and destroyed. This wasn't an accident of war. It was a deliberate act of cultural annihilation. That was the end, not with a bang, but with the shouts of a mob and the tearing of papyrus. What was lost is impossible to calculate. Entire plays by Sophocles and Euripides. The history of forgotten empires. Scientific treatises that could have pushed human progress forward by centuries. But the story of the library isn't just about loss. It's about why we remember it. We remember it because it represents a universal human dream, the dream of knowing everything, of understanding our world and our place in it. That dream didn't die in the ashes of the Serapeum. It went underground, carried in the minds of the scholars who fled, preserved in secret collections, and eventually re-emerged centuries later to fuel the Renaissance. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the idea behind it, the belief in the power of shared knowledge, is more alive today than ever before. It lives on, in every library, every university, and every time we ask a question and seek out the answer.